Hello, everyone. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Christian Hernandez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based out of the North Texas chapter, and I'm also a member of the National Political Committee, as well as a member of the GDC Training Subcommittee, who is co-hosting this call with our National Electoral Committee. It's a lot of committees, but for the sake of clarity, the GDC and the NEC are putting on this training tonight. This is the last of 3 trainings, an introduction to electoral work, but whether you're just starting off or you're looking to refresh your electoral efforts, I think there's a lot that is going to be learned tonight about messaging your electoral campaign, which, you know, as socialists is super important because we want to make sure that we are being authentically ourselves while also making sure that we are reaching the people that need to be reached within the working class. So thank you again for joining us. And if you haven't already, make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. And we're going to get started with just some guidelines of how to be a comrade during the call. If we can go to the next slide, just a reminder to be respectful in the chat, not only to each other, but to the facilitators. There will be chances for interaction, or we definitely love to hear feedback whenever we're going through the training or the presentation. So feel free to share anything that feels relevant, but just be mindful of the chat. For any questions, most importantly, please use the Q&A feature. We do not want questions to get lost in the chat, and we will have time at the end for questions, but we may also just answer questions as we're going through the training. So very important to be mindful of your question being answered through the course of the training. And then, of course, engage during the training. Feel free to share any responses or feedback in the chat when prompted or when you feel like it's appropriate. We definitely love to hear what folks have to say about the different parts of this training. Alrighty, if that sounds good to folks, then I'm going to run us through the agenda really quickly. If we can go to the next slide, we are first going to start off with shaping your message. Developing your messaging, finding your wedge issues, and being able to target your messaging in particular. Then we're going to go into earned media and what all that entails. And then we're going to close out with comms on the campaign trail. Super exciting stuff, but very important in the course of this work. So we are going to get started. All right, so we're going to get right into shaping your message. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as we know, electoral campaigns are all about communicating ideas to voters and, most importantly, persuading them to vote for your candidate. In DSA, we want to be able to convey to the working class why socialism is how we will build a better world. And our messaging needs to be able to build a base of support for our candidates. So tonight's training will discuss developing a winning message and then getting that message to voters through different methods. If we can go to the next slide. I'm so sorry about my cat. He's very loud. We're going to go into developing our message. The same simple message should be repeated over and over again in campaign materials, by door knockers, and every time the candidate speaks. I think a lot of folks can say that, that you recognize this in Bernie. He's very, very good at keeping everything on message, completely undeterred by journalists, by electeds, by anyone alike. He stays on message, and that's super important because it's what resonates with people. And most voters aren't actively into politics and don't follow the details of campaigns. They're not constantly on Twitter. So we have to do everything that we can to get a simple message that they can understand in their head. And if you're successful, they will remember 1 or 2 basic talking points on election day. And if your message is strong enough, these points will move them into action, into voting for your candidate, volunteering for your candidate, and going forward in that way. Next slide, please. So we want to start off with your candidate's story. What is it about the candidate's job or biography or their background that makes them trustworthy to look out for the interests of working class people in that district? And how does that, most importantly, set them apart from their opponents? What is unique about the district? How does the candidate represent the people of this district specifically? And how does this set them apart from their opponents? Always making sure that we're setting our candidate apart as the alternative to the status quo. And who are the enemies of the people in the district? So what about the candidate makes them a credible champion to take on these enemies, to address the issues that need to be addressed? And how does that set them apart from their opponents who more than likely are not actually taking on the enemies in this district? So that's sort of where we want to start with, is seeing what sets our candidates apart and what things makes our candidate credible to the people in the district, which is going to vary depending on your district. If we can go to the next slide, which is why it's very important that we find some wedge issues. We'll find a maximum of 2 to 3 simple wedge issues that you are going to emphasize, that differentiate your candidate from the opponent. The issues should be widely and deeply felt, not obscure bureaucratic details. Again, a lot of how things happen in the electoral field are very obscure to people. And so we need to be able to demystify what it means for your candidate to run. So kitchen table issues that people are already concerned about and are going to resonate with everyday people in the district. And so for each of those 2 to 3 issues, in one sentence, explain how it affects people in the district and how your candidate will directly address it. In one sentence, explain in everyday language how an enemy is taking advantage of the people in the district around this issue. In one sentence, explain why the opponent is unwilling to address it. And another sentence, explain what it is about your candidate's background that makes them trustworthy on this issue. And this is huge and super important part of all of this. Every candidate is going to say that they are going to make housing more affordable, that they're going to create good jobs, but why should voters trust your candidate when every other politician has lied to them? So again, building trust is super important because we know time and again how many electeds have completely betrayed the working class, and we want to make sure that we stand out from those candidates so people can easily identify them. If we can go to the next slide, I think this will feel very relevant to folks, but we also have to know our audience. There is a huge difference between voters and the discourse. These are often the 2 audiences for your communications. Everyday voters who don't follow politics closely are likely to have a 10th grade reading level. It's going to be super important that we're leading with our story, with our biography, what makes the candidate stand out, and being able to explain in very simple terms how this policy will help their life. Like, it needs to be catchy, it needs to be direct for it to resonate with folks who often don't have a lot of time to pay attention to sort of the minutia of how things get done in the district. And then, of course, you have the discourse amongst journalists, political junkies, who aren't people to be ignored necessarily, but because they can donate, they might make impactful endorsements, but for the most part, are not the people who are actually going to be voting for your candidate, which is why it's super important to distinguish between those 2 audiences. But it is also good for your campaign to be strategic in who you spend time and energy on. So you don't always have to respond to the noise, but you also want to make sure that if there are people who have influence or leverage in voters in your district, that you also make time to respond to those folks. If we can go to the next slide. So we also want to target our message. And that means estimating the ideological left-wing vote. It's always, Bernie's always a good example and a good way to start off with assessing what the left-wing vote looks like in your district. So how did Bernie and possibly other left-wing candidates do in the district? What percentage of voters can you expect to win based on a left-wing message? And if that number is over 50%, you can focus on ideological messaging. However, if it is lower, you will likely have to win non-ideological voters. So that's really important when we're starting to think about our message and who we're targeting. You want to get an estimate of specific subgroups. Are there specific populations that you can try to win within the district? Is there perhaps a large Vietnamese population? Is there a big hospital, a military base? What are the sites of struggle that exist within your district? And how can you refine your comms to target these specific subgroups? You also want to get a language breakdown. What percentage of voters speak what languages? Do you have an advantage in certain languages? It doesn't mean you have to have your candidate pull, a O'Rourke who's a candidate who ran in Texas with, speaking another language for the sake of speaking another language, but really making sure that our messaging, our materials are available if there are large groups of people who are not predominantly English speaking. And so when you're going through all of these and starting to run the numbers, how do you make these different groups add up to 51%, which is ultimately the way that we win these campaigns? So that's kind of it for the shaping the message. And now I'm going to take it over to Mike, who's going to introduce himself and talk a little bit more about a specific case study here in our home state of Texas.
Hey, everyone. Mike, he, him out of Austin, Texas. I wanted to talk about Jose Garza, who to me has some of the best communications I've ever seen on a DSA campaign. So Jose ran for district attorney here in Austin, Texas. And his number one pitch, I heard him give this speech probably 10,000 times. Every time someone asked him a question, he would just pivot back to this. He would say, 70% of prisoners in Travis County Jail haven't been convicted of a crime. I will end cash bail, so they won't be sitting in jail for a crime they haven't been convicted for. The incumbent won't. And he would just say that all the time. He had incredible message discipline. He stuck to it all the time. And it worked because it was a really powerful issue. And I think people recognize the just unfairness of the issue. And he was able to just keep bringing it up. And, I think even like his race happened, he was in the runoff when the George Floyd protests started. And, he'd get all kinds of questions about things that were going on. And he was still able to tie it back in. He'd say, people are upset. People are protesting about the racial injustice in our system. And a big example of that here in Travis County is that 70% of prisoners who are, prominently people of color are in jail for crimes they haven't been convicted of. And I'm going to end cash bail. And it was a winning message. People liked it. In the runoff, he beat the incumbent like 68-32, which is really, really impressive for, being an incumbent. And the other thing is that he was a former public defender on the border. He was the head of Austin's Workers Center. So, he was also able to sprinkle that in and say, he had experience changing the system and he had experience standing up for people, in the justice system. So I think it gave him that credibility that people trusted he'd actually do it because he was doing so well. The incumbent actually started saying she was going to end cash bail, which, people started to wonder, well, if you're in office, why haven't you done it yet? But he also, he had credibility where she didn't because he was able to say, she's been in office and hasn't done it. Whereas, I've been fighting for workers, fighting for people in the criminal justice system. So Jose is great. Really, really awesome campaign. The last thing I'd say is, Jose is a really, really left-wing candidate. I mean, he was a member of DSA. He's arguably the most left-wing DA in the country. But when he speaks, he just speaks really plainly. And it really just sounds like common sense, the stuff he's saying. Like, it doesn't sound radical at all. It just sounds like, well, of course, like, cops need to be held accountable, when they commit crimes. And, cops who have a history of lying, we can't take their testimony. We have to put them on a list. And, stuff like ending cash bail or not criminalizing marijuana. He was able to do all these reforms and just really, really make them seem like basic common sense. So, a lot of people, a lot of interest in Austin hate him. A lot of the police union hates him, but the people like him because he's just really, really good at staying on message. And to me, he's just a great example of how to run communications. So I'm going to kick it over to Matt Thomas, someone who's worked on a lot of campaigns in New York, and he's going to talk about putting some of this into practice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt. I am a member of Queens DSA in the New York City chapter. I got started in DSA in fall of 2018. I worked on Tiffany Gabon's campaign for Queens DA. Through that, I became close with Zohran Mamdani, started working with him for a year and a half on his campaign for state assembly, which was successful, happily. And then that ended in late 2020. And then earlier this year, I've been doing some work with some of our city council candidates here in New York. So thank you very much to the NEC for asking me to be with you all tonight. Christian gave a great overview about how to build the message. And then the question is, how do you get it out to the people? So that's what we're going to start off talking about with respect to earned media. If we could go to the next slide. So earned media is like press coverage that's not paid for, basically. So you can have like paid media, which can be of all kinds of varieties, like paid digital, paid mailers, paid canvas, but earned media is like press coverage, basically. And so you have to figure out how to get like the press to write about you or your candidate. And the thing about that is you have to develop a relationship with reporters in a kind of personal way. So you have to start obviously by making a press list, and you just want to, that's fairly straightforward. You just want to assemble a spreadsheet of, the major outlets that are relevant to the district. The more local, the better. And the more expansive, the better, because you never want to leave anything on the table. It's always better to have like one more recipient on the press list than not. So just be really expansive, but relevant, obviously, to the candidate or to the issue. And so once you have assembled that, you have an idea about who you should, and then you also need to sort of like figure out who are the influential voices in the discourse, or who are the well-respected journalists in the district or who cover the district, so that you can focus your attention on developing those relationships. The earned media is, let me just see so earned media, that's a discourse thing, obviously. And Christian mentioned the distinction between speaking with voters and the messaging for the discourse, and they complement each other. Obviously, it's not going to be the exact same, but you can deploy earned media coverage that you get for your communication with voters. So for example, we were able to get a couple of great hits in the New York Times of Zohran that were basically pretty complimentary. This was during the George Floyd protests, obviously. Zohran really hammered his opponent for taking money from police unions and correctional officers unions as recently as earlier that year. And we really hit her hard on that on social, and eventually got her to return the money. And it set off this cascade of other New York progressive politicians returning money from those unions. And so this was covered in the Times and noted that Zohran had sort of like was the catalyst for that. And so we printed that on a mailer with like the New York Times, typeface, which they actually sent us a cease and desist for. So don't do that. But always ask forgiveness, not permission. But so then you have a really great mailer. And so like, but the point of that is like, people are not going to necessarily, like the Times has a big audience, but even most, normie voters are not going to read the Times. But if you send it to them, on a mailer that is made to look like, like crinkled newspaper and has the New York Times typeface, then, you just send them what you want them to read, basically. And people are like, oh, the New York Times, I know that, like, that's prestigious. And then so sort of by osmosis, you get that glow. So that's just one way in which or you can, how do you get earned media in front of voters in a positive way? Obviously, people get it direct from the source, but then you can also use it on your lit, on mailers. You can mention it in person to people. But obviously, it starts with getting a lay of the land for the media landscape. Next slide. So the thing with your press list is that you'll want to send press releases to it. Press releases should go out for like big campaign milestones. So the launch, obviously, if you ever have a big event with like a lot of canvassers, if you get a major endorsement, or if there's something that the candidate wants to comment on that's sort of in the discourse that you think that you can have an impact with, send them out. I would say be pretty, like once a week, twice a week is good for press releases. More, I feel like, starts to lose its efficacy. Just from a technical perspective, mail them to yourself and then BCC the press list. You don't want to CC like, nightmare situation. And yeah, so be concise, include only facts, be direct, always include a quote from the candidate or whoever, like if it's an endorsement, a quote from the endorser, whoever, any type of person that is close with the campaign that is going to be mentioned, you can do a quote for, because people will just extract those quotes to run with the story. With press releases, I would encourage people to, this is just comes with practice, but like have a sense for like when you think you might be able to like get something placed. Like for example, in Zohran's race during the COVID pandemic, it was when it was just getting started, the state legislature passed this bill to give Cuomo basically like unlimited emergency powers. Under the law in New York prior to that, the governor could already be assigned like quite expansive emergency powers, but this bill that he forced through went even further, and it basically like allowed him to like suspend the law in relation to like any kind of like like bad thing happening. And so that was disturbing on a number of levels, but for Zohran as a candidate, having being of Muslim background, having experienced like discrimination and surveillance by the police, Astoria, Queens was also where we were running, was a huge hub of surveillance post 9/11 by the NYPD that took advantage of the lax legal regime in that period to do a lot of like really nasty stuff. And so we sent out a press release about that, and it got picked up in a number of publications. And so that's just kind of thing where it's like, keep your eye out for that's like, so nothing even happened, right? Like there was no big event or anything, but like, just keep your eye out for things that can be opportunities for you to comment on. Next slide. Working and pitching reporters. So the thing about lying fake news media is that it's made up of, human beings with their own, biases, preferences, personalities, and a good comms person is able to develop relationships with them. Not like super close, but like you should be able to like text with them, on a professional level, but maybe you even get friendlier and you develop, real friendships with some of them. Relationships are what get stories placed in most circumstances, or good stories. Like you can usually get something general, like if there is something genuinely newsworthy happening with your candidate, you can get like perfunctory coverage of it. But if you want like something flattering placed, or if you want more coverage than you'd get otherwise, you really have to develop relationships with reporters. So if you're just getting started, like, you can meet them for coffee, invite them to events, especially anywhere that they could get free food or drinks, and tailor your pitches so like a pitch can be like, you can cold DM or cold email or cold call someone with a pitch. And so in that situation, you would like maybe write out some notes about like the themes that you're going to hit. But if it's more casual, you can do that also, but like tailor it to their interests. So if they're on a particular beat, like if they're a client on the climate beat, how is the race relevant from a climate perspective? How is the candidate relevant from a climate perspective? Same thing with any issue. Is there some similarity they have with the candidate? Did they go to the same high school? Did they share some type of similar interest? That kind of thing. Anything to like, because as soon as you get in there, as soon as they start to like you or like the candidate, then the bias starts to work throughout all their coverage basically, and that's what you kind of want to maximize. I would say I love to do cold stuff. So like if a journalist follows your candidate's account on Twitter, always follow back, and I always will like send a pitch, like no matter what, like a personalized pitch, like soon after. It doesn't have to be super complicated or, but like you were clearly just on their mind, so you should try to exploit that fact and like keep yourself in their mind. It's always easier to like keep something going or keep them on a train of thought than to like start it up again. When they cover your candidate have Twitter aren't, they love metrics, their jobs depend on it. So if you can get people to click through on the stories, RT them on Twitter, get their serotonin flowing when they post about your candidate, like so much of this is like playing on all of these kind of like incentives within the media industry and then incentives within their own minds to see your candidate in a good light, and give you favorable coverage. Next slide. The news doesn't always just happen. Sometimes you have to go out and make the news happen yourself. So that can be like a press conference, like if there's a big issue, you can sometimes like, even if it's just like the candidate's going to speak on some topic at a certain location, that can be newsworthy. An open letter can be newsworthy from like the candidate or a group of candidates. Always reporters like trends, not one-off things, and they like big groups. And so if you get an open letter with 5 people on it, that's good. If you get an open letter with 15 people on it, that's better. If they are candidates, that's pretty good. If they're electeds, that's like pretty much guaranteed coverage. So you want to think about ways to create newsworthy events. Tomorrow, there's going to be there's going to be an action. I'm working now with the New York Taxi Workers Alliance to get on their debt relief campaign. And there's going to be a big action tomorrow will be newsworthy. But yeah, that's like, you have to take the initiative. Open letters, press conferences, protests, volunteer opportunities, that kind of thing. Always, and get validators. The more established, the better. Either sitting elected, high profile orgs, anything relevant to the current news cycle will be good also. Next slide. I feel like I've been talking about throughout the ways that we have, or that we worked with Sahran on earned media. I would say always be not aggressive, but like take every opportunity. Like if a reporter follows you, follow them back and DM them a pitch. Cold email reporters. If you see them at an event, talk to them. Don't leave anything on the table. Even if somebody doesn't follow you, like if they have open DMs, like slide into their DMs. I forget how, like, I think the Gravel Institute followed Zohran on Twitter, or I think I might have just cold DM'd them. But we ended up getting him to do a video with them that is now like their most viewed ever. And it's so beautiful. It's like beautifully done. It's about socialist housing policy. And anything that you can get like that is just like, especially like video or photography that's done. There's some great, beautiful photos that Zohran got in the Times. Those are things that you can use forever. Like you can always return to that in a future campaign for future messaging. So anything that's just you can get that's durable is good. Next slide. Okay, so on the campaign trail, so we're talking about how to deploy the core message in various arenas. So we just talked about the earned media. This will be about how the candidate interfaces with the public, basically. So next slide. So what we just talked about was like the comms person's interfacing with the media. This is for the candidate. How do you prepare the candidate to speak to different audiences? One of them obviously will be interviews. Interviewing is a skill. It takes practice. Speaking in public for candidates will often take practice. Basically, every candidate they've ever seen or worked with has been kind of like bad at like speaking in public at the beginning. It's not a natural thing, unless they have like their career is in that. But usually that will not be the case. If you're lucky, you'll have like a cadre DSA person who is sort of like, you know, not used to the spotlight running. And then they'll need a lot of work. That's fine. Like the transformation, even like in Tiffany or Zahran from the beginning of their campaign to the end, is like so incredible. And so don't like beat yourself up if you feel like an interview doesn't go well or like something, you know, that'll just get better with time. So as a comms person, you should prep your candidate for every interview. That'll be in the beginning, and then only like for big ones going forward, they'll eventually feel comfortable taking them on their own. But yeah, they'll often want to be prepped because they'll be nervous. And so as a comms person, you should, you know, be the calm one, be the source of like stability, and, you know, just make them feel at ease. Give them information about the interviewer, information about the publication, questions you think they might ask. Always you can discuss with the reporter what they're going to ask beforehand. They may not be super responsive, but you should always ask. And always think about like who the audience is for the publication and tailor your message to that. But always make sure that you're repeating the campaign messaging. So you basically, like I developed docs or different documents that, you know, list out all this stuff in a very like one pagers. You're going to love one pagers that are just like, what are the talking points? Like, what are the three wedge issues? What do we say about them? Eventually the candidate will become fluent with it, but always make one pagers that like include the major talking points for the campaign. Yeah, just until the candidate gets fluent with them. Next slide. Yeah, so so that's the media. Another audience that the candidate will be meeting with is like, you know, civil society, basically, NGOs, neighborhood orgs, validators from the community. When the candidate's time is always really valuable because the candidate is the one that is most able to persuade voters. So like you want to maximize the candidate's exposure to the public and to people. You want to maximize that. And so when you are thinking about what are you going to do with the candidate's time, you should always have that in mind. And so when you're thinking about like if a group wants to meet with you, can they deliver votes? Are they a real group, or are they mostly like a paper thing? What is their reach? Are they in the district? Yeah, this can be a huge time suck. Don't hesitate to skip or send a surrogate. Send a surrogate's always a good alternative, and that can even be a volunteer. Yeah, I would say that, you know, these validator NGOs like WFP, or like there's so many in New York. They can't usually deliver a lot in terms of votes. They can give you, they're important to cultivate because they feed on each other. Like for example, like the WFP in New York is composed of a variety of different affiliates, both labor unions and NGOs. And so if you get one, you know, maybe they have a better relationship with another NGO, and or maybe their executive directors know each other or something. And so then you get the other, and then all of a sudden, like you have this like node or clutch of people within the WFP that are for you. And then maybe your candidate is the member of a union that is a WFP affiliate. And so these things build on each other, and then maybe you get the WFP. And even if you get it, even if they are not able to provide a lot of things, that's resources that they won't give to somebody else or an opponent. That's also a big validator with the media. And so you should try and think about, when you're deciding whether it's worth it or not to engage with one of these groups, thinking about, can they deliver votes? Obviously, if they can, then you want to do that. But if they can't, do they have some kind of like social value or value within this sort of like nonprofit mafia that can tie up or start a chain reaction of like, you know, getting that support towards you and taking it away from your opponents. But always just be mindful of that. Questionnaires, oh my God, like there's gonna be so many questionnaires, like reuse the same answers, keep a list of your answers. Obviously always tailor them as needed. But definitely if you can get volunteers, like a team of like 2 or 3 volunteers to help with that, it's so much work and it's so awful. So definitely save those answers. Next slide. Another way to that you will interface with the public, obviously, you know, you'll canvass, you'll door knock, you'll phone bank, you'll text bank, but then mailers are important also. They're really affordable. I don't know if we've ever run TV or radio ads for a candidate in New York. They're so expensive, but definitely mailers I think are really important because they can look really beautiful. They're better than like regular lit. I would say get a really, if you can, like, you don't skimp on design. We were really blessed on Zahran's campaign to have a really talented designer, Kara McCurdy. And well, we had a team, we had a few, but she was the lead one. She designed a lot of our mailers for free. That was so good. But like, if you've got somebody like that, if you have relationships like that, definitely lean on those. But if you don't skip on it either, because I think like a really beautiful mailer that is really well crafted, sent at the right time, it's going to be in front of a lot of eyes, or at least more than other types of lit would be. And so I think those are really important. We have a few examples. So I'm going to, the next 3 slides will be, okay, so this will be, can we go to the next slide actually? Yeah, okay, so this is an example, and you should always try to differentiate the mailers. So this is the first mailer that we sent out. As you said, the front is on the left and the back is on the right. Oh, I guess it's more of a philosophical question, but very minimal text, as you can see. We have the biography. So what he does, foreclosure prevention counselor, what does that mean? Help families stay in their homes. So Arhan had kind of like a weird job. So we were constantly talking about like, how do we communicate what that is? Like his technical title, I think, was housing counselor or foreclosure prevention counselor. I think it was housing counselor, and we said that nobody would understand what that was. So we just said foreclosure prevention counselor. That like says it. You can think about these types of things. Like if it's not like, don't just use like your like LinkedIn title, like think about how to communicate what the candidate does in an easy to understand way. Democrat running for state assembly. Now we know that we live in we have 2 parties of capital. Democrats, obviously class enemies, but people really like Democrats, unfortunately. Voters in Democratic primaries, they want to vote for the Democrat. And so you want them to know that you're running as a Democrat. The reason for running: housing unaffordable, bills unpayable, communities at risk from a dangerous jail and prison system. And then the solution. So we have the candidate. Who are they? What did they do? Why do they have credibility? What are the problems and what are the solutions? And it's in like 4 or 5 sentences. And then on the back, this was during COVID. So obviously, you know, the numbers just sort of seen, numbers are a really effective tool on mailers. They can communicate a lot of information in little space. So that just sort of gives an overview of what the crisis is, and then what were the solutions: cancel rent, expand and strengthen unemployment benefits, free treatment for coronavirus. So now this is, it's interesting to look back at this because it's so, there's very little about, it's all about COVID, right? Like it's not, none of our 3 wedge issues are there. But we felt that, and I think it was wise to do that I can't imagine, hopefully nothing like earth shattering will happen again like that. But we made the decision to be responsive in the moment. And so I guess that's just a kind of a lesson in like, be able to roll with the punches, and do what is going to be what best received. Like there was no way to like, I forget when this went out, it must have been like March or something. There was no way to like act like it wasn't happening. So just, use your judgment. So anyway, this was the one that went out to the full universe. So like when you construct your universe like, of like, however many 10,000 voters, but then you should segment it. So can we go to the next slide? So there is a big Muslim and Arab Muslim and South Asian population in Astoria. And so we shifted the mailer slightly to go out to those universes specifically. So what are the differences? My name is Zarhan. I'm an Indian Ugandan New Yorker. So just putting the identity in there. I work as a foreclosure prevention counselor, helping South Asian families stay in their homes, as opposed to just, all families. Democrat again, and then we bring in the identity again, never had a South Asian elected official in city history. And this lack of representation means our needs are going unmet. And so those are the changes on the front. And on the back, there's a big rideshare and taxi driver community in both the Muslim and South Asian populations here. So we included the classified drivers as employees, and provide them with the same rights and benefits, and also the number of taxi drivers who had died of COVID at that point, because there were quite a few. And that was a big issue for them. So just tailoring it to that population. Next slide. And then a few more in front. One more. Yes. So the same thing for Muslim. Can you go back to the last? There we go. So this one opens with Salam Alaikum and Ramadan Kareem. That was Zarhan's innovation. Very good, I thought. He's a Muslim New Yorker in this one. In our borough's history, we've never had a Muslim assembly person. So there has never been a South Asian person in the city, but then there has been other Muslims elsewhere in the city. So we made that to Queens. So just tailored again. I think the back is the same as the South Asian one. So I would always advise, it's so low cost. It doesn't actually cost any money to like tailor the mailer. So I would definitely segment the mailer universe in as many ways as makes sense. Don't go too crazy, but like if there's, these are the ones we felt were appropriate. And I think it was really important because Zarhan ended up winning by like 400 votes, is like by 2%. And he had huge support in election districts that are have a lot of South Asian and Muslim representation. I think it was super important. If you could go back, I think 3 slides. So this is an issue-based mailer. This, if you look in the top right-hand corner, this is the front of it. It's a little small, but it is specifically about the taxi driver issue. I forget how many ended up dying in the first months of the pandemic, but it's quite a few. And like rideshare demand just totally collapsed, obviously. And so these people were really, really crushed. And there's quite a few in the district. And obviously they have, families that all, that vote. And so we felt that this was important. And the historic nature of Zarhan's candidacy was important to highlight. And we ended up having so much support from that community. Like they organized a caravan on election day all around the district, a dozen taxis, with Zarhan posters and pictures of his face, and honking. And Zarhan went around with a megaphone, leaning out the window, getting out the vote. And it was just really special, the support that we got from that community. And again, very not too text heavy. Bullet points, always good. This is a great example of like using the earned media. This is an earned media, but as you can see, why don't New York why doesn't New York have these benefits already that we're advocating for these drivers? And we just brought in the oppo here. Our opponent took money from people that were affiliated with like Uber lobbyists and taxi fleet owners who exploit drivers that lease their medallions. And as you can see, like the proprietary typeface that they made us stop using. We can go to the next slide, or yeah. Social media, I know I'm running over our time here. Social media best practices. Really try and wrestle the control of the Twitter away from the candidate. They may resist. I had to send Zohran all the tweets that I wanted to tweet in the beginning so he could approve them and then do them himself. Eventually, I got him off of that. Make sure that you do that as well. Yeah, try and make it authentic to the candidate's voice. Only one person should ever be tweeting. You and the candidate, or the comms person and the candidate should have access to the Twitter, not multiple people, like only those people. Use a social media management program. I'm spiritually 1,000 years old, so I don't know how to use any of those, but I believe that many people do it successfully. So yeah, just get control of the candidate's Twitter account and develop trust there. Ask for approval before posting anything controversial. Make it be in the candidate's voice. And again, that look for opportunities to get viral content, and also use it as a venue to articulate the message that you're hitting in other places. So like you should be hitting the same types of messaging at the doors, in the mailers, on the lit, in social. Yeah. Next slide. This is the last one, I think. Secrets of social media success. Yeah, a few times a day on Twitter, once a day max on Instagram grid. Instagram story can be as many as you want. Once a day max on Facebook. Be brief, try and be funny. You can try not to be too cringe with like jumping on meme bandwagons, but if you've got like a really good one, one I'm particularly proud of is like when Ed Markey beat Joe Kennedy. We did these photos of like Joe Kennedy and then Ed Markey, Joe, and like some fucking like GQ spread, and Ed Markey like, looking like, just like fresh off the Fisher boat or something. Like the guy she told you not to, you versus the guy she told you not to worry about, that got like 20,000 likes. Yeah, so that kind of thing is always good. Yeah. So I think that's everything. The next slide is Q&A. So if anyone has any questions related to anything that any of the co-presenters have said tonight, feel free. Oh, how is messaging? Oh my God, this was asked a while ago, my apologies. How is messaging for challenging a Dem incumbent from the left different from challenging a GOP opponent? I think, well, obviously you're going to be able to talk about like, the tone will be different because you'll be able to do things like, are they a real, it's about authenticity, I guess. Like you're not going to message that the GOP opponent is being hypocritical about some progressive stance they've taken. I guess there's like hypocrisy is going to be a big theme, or I think the issue of trust is also, I guess what I would say is that like with a Dem opponent, it's these softer questions of trust, credibility, hypocrisy. It's a little bit different unless you've got a real like scumbag, that it's not going to be like rallying the troops to resist the right wing. Sometimes it's like that in New York. There's a bunch of people like Democrats who are like that. But I think it will involve, the other thing is like what I would really advise is like, it's so painful to say, but like things like, oh, this person isn't a real Democrat, or like they don't uphold democratic values, people do kind of go for that messaging. Um, it's complicated. Like we're trying to build like a party surrogate operating, under the brand name of the Democratic Party. We don't want to give undue legitimacy to the party, but we also can't ignore the fact that like that Democratic Party brand unfortunately does have legitimacy with voters. So you just have to kind of like strike the balance between building the independent power and brand of DSA and acknowledging that these kind of softer questions of trust, legitimacy can be very effective in a primary campaign. Can you speak a bit about the utility of op-eds, or is it best to seek out other earned media opportunities that involve reporters? I think that, if you've got an op-ed opportunity, that you have to take advantage, like be a real yes and person. Take any opportunity for earned media that you can get. I think that earned media is better than op-eds just because it gives you legitimacy. Like, it's hard to know, like any one article doesn't give you a ton, but like if you can get covered a lot in the press, other people in the press start to pay attention. It's so incestuous, but like that's what you're going for. You want to get in these people's heads. You want them to think of you. You want to be the person that they reach out to for a quote about X, Y, or Z issue. We got like 5 or 6. Sahran got covered in the Times 5 or 6 times during his primary campaign before he was an elected official, because I like developed a relationship with this reporter. And so when they needed a quote from the left, who's going to speak for the left, like Zohran would be the person they went to. And like, that's kind of like an example of like a bias, like reporters are lazy. So like, they just want to keep the same, they want people on hand to complement their stories. And so if you can be one of those people for them, like that's huge. And so I think that being that is dependent on coverage as opposed to op-eds. Because if you're being covered, that makes you understood to be legitimate in some kind of way from the perspective of the press. I saw one of the mailers that was paid for by DSA for the many. Can you talk about how you stayed on the right side of coordination laws? I'm in California and it's somewhat hard to read and understand the law. You need a compliance person. I really encourage everyone. We have like the compliance queen of New York, Lindsay Pratt, who leads the effort citywide basically, but like it's one of the things that is least people least want to do because it's so complicated and bureaucratic. In New York, the laws are like insane, but you should have like a compliance lead on the campaign's team. I don't know how it would be different. In New York, we have a compliance team that is like a citywide team. And so our compliance lead on the campaign liaised with and got support from the citywide compliance team. If you can have any kind of structure like that, I would encourage it. DSA for the many is really complicated. It's a multi-candidate committee. It's going to be different everywhere, but I would just really encourage, because this is a way that they can fuck with you, especially if you're challenging powerful people. You can invite retaliation on this area. And so I would really don't skimp on compliance. It's my advice. How would okay, I think that's all the Q&As.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. I'm just gonna put my email in the chat. You can reach out to me. I'll put the DSA NEC email, or the National Electoral Committee. That's another place you can reach out to. If you have any questions, reach out. Someone will get back to you. If you have some of these compliance questions or strategy questions, definitely reach out. Yeah, the last question I want to ask is Nathan Turner asks, how would messaging look for a campaign in a traditionally GOP rural district that, despite GOP dominance, has a sizable number of pro-Bernie and ideological left, but generally apolitical individuals in the district? I'm going to be 100% honest. DSA, we don't have a lot of experience winning in those districts. I think we can talk about, winning in some of these blue districts because, people like Matthew have run campaigns that won there and taken out incumbents. In some of these rural districts, these Republican districts, we really don't know. So I'd be lying if I said I knew what worked. I think probably focusing on the issues, I think could make sense. I think in some of those areas, I think maybe running independently, if it's a place that really doesn't like Democrats, we kind of usually, in a lot of deep blue districts, it makes sense to run a Democratic primary, in places where people like to vote for Democrats. In places where people don't, I think running independently. But we really just need to try these experiments and see what works. I would be lying if I said I knew what would work there, but definitely, try it and, kind of report back, and maybe you can kind of crack the code and see what works, because we definitely don't know. That's a lowercase L in mine. I'll type it again. But yeah, thanks so much for being on the call. If you go to dsausa.org/trainings, there'll be more trainings, but yeah, super glad everyone could be on. And I hope y'all run some great campaigns and do some great communications. Christian, do you have anything before we sign off?
Nope, that's it for me. Thanks so much for joining us. And we will make sure to get out the recordings. I know some folks asked about those in particular, and get that information available to folks. But I will reiterate the importance of reaching out to the NEC, building that relationship, so you can get guidance and support throughout the course of the campaign, and also meet people who've, have this experience in many different arenas to make sure that we are winning. So thanks everyone for joining us, spending time with us tonight, and we'll see you at the next training. Have a good night, everyone.